I was standing barefoot on the cold stone floor of my grandfather Zevolin's study at 4 in the morning, staring at a wooden shelf that held exactly 43 books, none of which had ever been touched by anyone under the age of 50. The window behind me was fogged with winter breath. Outside, the village of Krasnopolia was still asleep, its chimneys dormant, its dogs curled into themselves like parentheses around a sentence no one had finished writing. I was 9 years old, and I had just been told something that I did not understand, but that I knew. The way you know the smell of rain before it arrives would change the direction of every single morning that followed. My grandfather did not look at me when he spoke. He was tracing the spine of a book with one finger, slowly, the way a blind man reads a map. He said, in that voice of his that sounded like gravel shifting at the bottom of a river, "Mordecai, the distance between a man who has everything and a man who has nothing is not money. It is not land. It is not even intelligence, though intelligence is useful when it obeys." He paused. He turned. His eyes were the color of winter sky over a lake. He said, "The distance is a single question, and most men never ask it." I did not ask him what the question was. I was too afraid of the answer. For the next 22 years, I forgot about that moment the way you forget a dream by noon. I became a student, then a teacher, then a man who wore pressed shirts to places that did not deserve pressed shirts. I moved to a city called Brynhaven, which sits on the edge of a coast that smells like salt and engine oil, and I built what most people would look at and call a comfortable life. I had an apartment with 2 windows that faced east. I had a job explaining old texts to young people who were mostly thinking about other things. I had a friend named Ifigon, who laughed too loudly at his own observations, and who I loved for exactly that reason. I had routines. Routines are the amber that preserves a man's mediocrity in perfect detail. And then one morning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, while I was sitting in a bakery called the Flour Mill, watching rain streak diagonally across the glass, I heard 2 men at the table behind me talking. I was not eavesdropping with intention, but one of them said something that cracked the ordinary Tuesday open like an egg. He said, "The problem with Oswaldo is that he keeps trying to solve the symptom." The other man said, "What do you mean?" The first man said, "I mean he keeps rearranging the furniture. He moves the chair, he moves the lamp, he replaces the curtains, but he never asks why the room feels wrong." I did not know Oswaldo. I did not know these men, but I put down my coffee and I sat very still, because I had just heard my grandfather's voice in the mouth of a stranger in a bakery in Brynhaven on a Tuesday in the rain. The question. I had never asked it, not once, not in 22 years of pressing shirts and teaching texts and watching rain from bakeries. I had been rearranging furniture. I had been moving chairs. I had been mistaking activity for direction. Now here is the part of the story where I need you to lean forward, because what I am about to tell you is not a metaphor dressed up as advice. It is the actual architecture of how I came to live the way I live, and why the life I live now bears no resemblance to the life I was living on that Tuesday. I need you to stay with me, because the thing I am going to give you has no market value. You cannot package it. You cannot sell it in 4 installments. But if you receive it properly, it will dismantle something inside you that has been quietly costing you everything. The question my grandfather meant was this: what am I actually building? Not what am I doing, not what am I earning, not what am I maintaining or managing or enduring, but what am I building? What is the structure that will still be standing when I am no longer standing? Most people, if you stop them on the street and ask them what they are building, will describe their schedule. They will tell you about their job, their obligations, their weekend plans. They will confuse movement with construction. They will describe the act of laying bricks without ever mentioning what the building is supposed to be. I was one of those people. Let me introduce you to a man named Theron Bash. I met Theron 3 months after the bakery. He was 64 years old, and he lived in a house in the hills outside Brynhaven that had been designed, he told me, to catch the last light of the afternoon and hold it for as long as physics would permit. He had made a significant amount of money in his life through a series of decisions that appeared from the outside to be either lucky or inexplicable. From the inside, as he explained it to me over a dinner of lentil soup and dark bread that tasted like it had been baked by someone who understood patience, they were neither. Every decision I made, Theron said, tearing bread slowly, came from the same place. I was always asking one thing. I said, "What were you asking?" He looked at me the way my grandfather used to look at me, with that particular quality of patience that is not waiting, but seeing. He said, "I was always asking what this decision would make possible 10 years from now, that is currently impossible. Not what it would give me now, not even what it would give me next year. What would it make possible that currently cannot exist?" I wrote that down on a paper napkin. I still have it. The ink has bled slightly into the texture of the paper, which somehow makes it feel more permanent. Here is what happened next, and I want to be precise because precision matters in this part. I went back to my apartment with the east-facing windows, and I sat down at the table where I usually graded papers, and I made a list. On one side of the list, I wrote everything I was currently doing. On the other side, I wrote what each of those things made possible in 10 years. I worked on this list for 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, I had a sheet of paper with a very full left column and a nearly empty right column. Almost everything I was doing was making nothing new possible. It was maintaining. It was preserving. It was keeping the current state of affairs from deteriorating, which is a necessary function, but not a constructive one. I was not building. I was insulating. This is not a small distinction. This is the entire game. Insulating means you are protecting what exists. Building means you are creating what does not exist yet. Both require effort. Both require time, but only one of them leads anywhere new. And most people who are frustrated by their circumstances, who feel the low, constant ache of a life that should be larger, are insulating. They are working hard to keep things from getting worse. They have never once asked what they are working toward making possible. I called Ifigon that night. He answered on the 4th ring with the sound of a television in the background. I told him what I had discovered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's actually uncomfortable to think about." And I said, "Yes, that's how you know it's real." Now I need to tell you what changed, concretely, because I am not interested in giving you philosophy without architecture. The first thing I changed was how I used the first 90 minutes of my day. Before, I used those 90 minutes to respond to everything that had accumulated overnight. Messages, requests, small logistical puzzles. The daily debris of a life lived in proximity to other people's needs. I was starting every day in reactive posture, which means I was starting every day already behind, already in debt to other people's agendas. After. I used those 90 minutes to work on what I was building, not to maintain, not to respond, not to insulate, to build, to move one stone forward on the structure that would make something new possible. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is one of the hardest things I have ever practiced, and I use the word practiced deliberately, because it required repetition before it became natural, and it required failure before repetition became possible. There were weeks when I slid back. There were mornings when the debris won, but the direction held, and direction held across time produces results that appear, to outside observers, to be either lucky or inexplicable. The second thing I changed was who I asked for opinions. Before, I asked people who were close to me, my colleagues at the university, Ifigon, people I trusted emotionally, people who cared about my well-being, people who would never intentionally steer me wrong. After, I asked people who were doing what I wanted to do. Not similar things, not adjacent things, the exact thing I wanted to do, or something close enough that the principles transferred. This distinction is brutal and necessary. The people who love you will protect you from risk. The people who have done what you want to do will show you that risk is navigable. These are not the same service. You need both, but you cannot confuse them. Your loved one's fear about your future is not the same as information about your future. It is love wearing the costume of expertise, and while the love is genuine, the costume is borrowed. I started having dinners with people like Theron. I started asking different questions. The shape of my thinking began to change, slowly, the way a river changes the shape of a valley. Not quickly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The third thing I changed is the one that I suspect you have been waiting for, and I want to address it directly because there is a version of this kind of story that ends with a single dramatic revelation, a product, a technique, a secret combination. And if you are waiting for that, I am going to respectfully redirect your attention. The third thing I changed was my relationship with discomfort. I had been, my entire adult life, an expert avoider of a specific category of discomfort. Not physical discomfort, not intellectual discomfort. I was willing to work hard physically. I was willing to think about difficult things. What I was not willing to do was exist in sustained fashion in a state of not yet knowing whether something I cared about deeply was going to succeed or fail. This is a very particular flavor of discomfort. It has a specific texture. It lives somewhere between the sternum and the throat. It is the feeling of having committed to something that matters without being able to see the outcome. Most people cannot tolerate this feeling for more than a few weeks before they find a way to exit it. They abandon the thing that is causing it. They pivot. They discover new priorities. They become very interested in something else entirely. And they call this adaptability, but it is not adaptability. It is escape with better vocabulary. The things that build the kind of life I wanted required me to sit inside that discomfort for months, sometimes for years, without the exit, without the guarantee, without the reassurance that the building was going to stand before I had finished building it. Nobody tells you this, or rather, many people tell you this, but they tell you in the abstract, as a concept, as an inspirational statement printed on something, which means it passes through you without leaving a mark. I am telling you from the inside of the experience, from the specific memory of sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, 3 months into something that had not yet produced a single visible result, wondering with complete sincerity whether I had misread everything and made a decision that was going to cost me more than I could afford to lose. I did not leave. I stayed. Not because I was certain, I was not certain. I stayed because I had asked what I was building, and I knew the answer. And the answer was worth the discomfort of uncertainty. My grandfather Zebulon died in the autumn of a year when the leaves in Krasnopoli were the most extraordinary color I have ever seen them. I was there. I was holding his hand, which was very light. The way old things become light when they have put everything into the world and kept nothing for themselves. And I leaned close to him and I said, "I asked the question." He looked at me. He was very old and very far away, in that way that people get close to the end, when they are partly somewhere else already. But he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that does not require the whole face, and he said, "Good. Now do not stop asking it." I have not stopped. The life I live now is not the life I lived in that apartment with the east-facing windows. It is not the life of pressed shirts worn to places that do not deserve pressed shirts. I live now in a house outside a town called Veranstal, which has a market on Thursdays where a woman named Oksana Prail sells preserves made from fruit that I cannot find anywhere else in the world. I work on things that matter to me, with people who are building, not just insulating. I have time in the mornings. I have resources. I have the particular peace of a man who knows what he is building and why. I am telling you this not to perform a rival. A rival is not a place. I am telling you this because the distance between where I was and where I am was not a special talent or an inherited advantage or a fortunate accident. It was a question. And then it was the willingness to stay inside the discomfort of acting on the answer. You have the question now. What you do with it is yours entirely. But let me leave you with one last thing, because this is where most stories of this kind close too soon. The question is not a one-time event. It is not a destination. You do not ask it once and bank the answer and spend the rest of your life drawing on the account. You ask it every time you are about to commit your time, your attention, your energy, your morning. You ask it when you are tired and when it would be easier not to ask it. You ask it when the answer is inconvenient, especially then. You ask it in the bakery on a Tuesday in the rain, and in your grandfather's study at 4 in the morning, and in every ordinary moment that does not announce itself as important, but that turns out, years later, to have been the exact hinge on which everything swung. What are you building? Ask it right now, not after this, right now. Put the question against whatever you are spending your days on. See what it tells you. And if you are at the beginning of that reckoning, if you are sitting in the middle of a life that feels like it is maintaining rather than constructing, if you recognize yourself in any part of what I have said here, then I want you to do one more thing before this window closes. Subscribe to this channel. Not because I will tell you what to build. I cannot tell you that. No one can tell you that. But because what I will keep bringing you are the questions that the people who are building their lives are asking, and the frameworks they are using, and the specific, unglamorous, unsexy work of staying in the discomfort long enough for the structure to begin to show. There are conversations I am planning to share here that took me years to have access to. I want to shorten that distance for you. I want to put the question in front of you regularly, in different forms, from different angles, until it becomes the natural lens through which you see your own days. The subscription button is the smallest possible commitment. The decision it leads to is one of the largest. My grandfather would have said, that is a good ratio. I think he would have been right.